Good to see you all here this morning. Last week in our series on Easter, the crossroads of your life, we looked at the olive grove called Gethsemane. And that was really difficult for people to understand that it's a very deep and personal experience that we have in that olive grove of Gethsemane as we look at the last 12 hours of Jesus' life. Today we're looking at the Messiah on trial, part 2. And this too will be also very personal for you to take on board for your own life what Christ went through in that whole trial. I want you to understand something very important today, and that is that Jesus faced man's injustice so we don't have to face God's justice. And in this series, The Passion of the Christ, the suffering of Christ, last week in this drama we saw Jesus praying alone in the olive grove of Gethsemane. We saw that Jesus was alone in his agony so that we don't have to be alone in ours. We understand that the only way out is to go all the way through. And prayer gives us power over temptation. And even though each and every one of us must face our own olive grove of Gethsemane experience in order to fulfill the call that God has placed on each of our lives, we know that we never have to face it alone. God is with us every step of the way, even amongst our own weakest of moments. A lot of people don't like the olive grove of Gethsemane experience. A lot of people they see it there, but they want to walk around it. They want to go a different way and not to experience the same pain and suffering and heartache of Jesus. But we can't avoid it. Some people they see it, they walk in, say it's too hard, it's too scary, it's too painful, and walk out. But that's a lack of trust and lack of faith in God. But today, we're not going into that. We did that last week. Today, we're looking at Act 2, Part 2. The arrest and trial of Christ up to the point to where he was to be crucified. And then look at the crucifixion and what he went through on Good Friday. And today we're going to follow the story in all the 4 Gospels, and we're going to close with a meditation, something for you to take home today and think about each day this week leading up to Good Friday. So we're going to look at the arrest and trial of Christ up to the point to where he was sent to be crucified. We're going to look at Mark chapter 14, verses 43 right through to chapter 15, verse 20. I'm not going to do the Bible reading as it's done throughout the sermon here today. We're going to look at where Jesus was arrested. After he finished praying, he woke up Peter, James and John, and he told them that the betrayer had arrived. In verse 43, we see immediately as he said this to Judas that one of the 12 disciples arrived with the mob, and he was armed with swords and clubs. They'd been sent out by the leading priests and the teachers of the religious laws and the other leaders. And for those arresting Jesus, bringing a mob armed with swords and clubs seemed to be a wise precaution. But to us and others that we know what we know about Jesus, it just seemed utterly foolish. The arrest of Jesus illustrates how little these religious leaders understood the teachings of Jesus. And they were convinced he would resist, and they were prepared for battle. In verse 34, Judas had given them a pre-arranged signal. You will know which one to arrest when I go over and give him a kiss of the greeting. Then you can take him away under guard. And as soon as they arrived, Judas walked up to Jesus. Teacher, he exclaimed, and gave him a kiss. Skipping over to Luke's Gospel. In Luke chapter 22, verse 48, Jesus said, "Judas, how can you betray me, the Son of Man, with a kiss?" This prearranged signal was another precaution on the part of those arresting Jesus. First, they wanted to make sure that they themselves weren't getting tricked. They didn't want Judas to pull a fast one, so to speak, and arrest the wrong man. Secondly, they didn't want Jesus to try to deny that he was the man that they were looking for. They wanted to see Judas interact with Jesus in a way that would confirm to them that this man was in fact the man that they were looking for. So Judas, he approached Jesus as a follower when he expected to approach his teacher, offer him a greeting and a kiss of respect on the cheek. And while the other disciples saw what was about to happen, they exclaimed, "Lord, should we fight? We brought swords," it says in Luke chapter 22, verse 49. Then Simon Peter drew the sword and he slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup the Father has given me?" John chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. Jesus said, "Don't resist anymore." And he touched the place where that man's ear had been and he healed him. Luke 22, verse 51. And all the four gospel accounts, the mention of the high priest's servant's ear being cut off. But Mark just says that it happens and he gives no other detail. Matthew says it was done by one of the men with Jesus. John specifies that it was Peter who did it and gave the name of the servant. And Luke records that Jesus healed the servant's ear. This is an example of how each gospel writer telling their story emphasises different aspects of the event. And this is the only miracle recorded in the Passion or the Suffering narrative. And then Jesus spoke to the leading priests and the captains of the temple guard and the other leaders who headed the mob. He said, "Am I some dangerous criminal," he asked, "that you have come armed with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there every day, but this is your moment, the time when the power of darkness reigns." Luke chapter 22, verses 51 and 53. The power of darkness reigns. Such ominous words, aren't they? Jesus knew in the next 12 hours or so that all hell would break loose on earth in the most literal sense of that phrase. The creator of the universe would be beaten. He would be spat upon. He'd be ridiculed. He would be murdered. He'd be crucified by his own creation. In the next 12 hours, evil would reign in a way that never has or before since. Remember that even though that Jesus is God, he's also man, fully human, fully divine. He knows the injustice is soon to occur. He knows that the pain that will be required to endure. He knows the spiritual battles that will be fought. And so he says, this is the time when the power of darkness reigns. In verse 50 he says, "Meanwhile all his disciples deserted him and ran away." He was left all alone. Mark includes one more detail in verses 51 and 52. He says this, "There was a young man following along behind, clothed only in linen nightshirt. When the mob tried to grab him, they tore off his clothes and he escaped and he ran away naked." Scholars have speculated this young man in this verse was Mark himself, the writer of the Gospels. But regardless, it emphasises the fact that Jesus' followers abandoned him at this point, and he was left all alone. Jesus was tried before the council. In verse 53, Jesus was led to the high priest's home, where the leading priests and other leaders and the teachers of the religious law had gathered. According to the laws in the Mishnah, the Jewish book of procedural law, there were several illegal things that had occurred in Jesus' trial before the council. The first was this: trials were not to be held at night. Secondly, trials were not to be held during the festivals. This is occurring during the Passover festival. Thirdly, the accused was permitted to have legal counsel. And fourthly, the capital verdicts, things like death sentences, could not be reached in one day. Because of these illegalities, some have said in the gospel accounts must be therefore inaccurate. They mustn't be true. But the response to that is that, first of all, we're going to correct them because some of the standards that I mentioned above, may not have been firmly placed in 70 AD. And secondly, it's thoroughly possible for a miscarriage of justice to occur, especially when powerful men are hell-bent on making it happen. There was a miscarriage of justice that perpetrated against Jesus that occurred in the hands of a few power-hungry men. There had been a great deal of discussion in recent years on whether or not The Passion of the Christ is an anti-Semitic film, and even whether or not the New Testament is an anti-Semitic book, as one reporter from the Washington Post had written and asserted. And it's no surprise that someone from the Washington Post had done that. The Passion narrative is not anti-Semitic. After all, Jesus and his followers were just as Jewish as the Sanhedrin. I like this, taken from the Good News according to Mark from Edward Schweizer. He says this: whoever is conscious of his own negligence in obedience, of his own failure to love, or the lethargy of his own heart in the midst of demands of everyday life, cannot escape his responsibility before God for Jesus' death by fixing the blame upon another person. Think about that as I continue on. Let that soak into your own heart. Verses 55 to 59. Inside, the leading priests and the entire council were trying to find witnesses who would testify against Jesus so they could put him to death. But their efforts were in vain. Many false witnesses spoke up against him, but they contradicted each other. Finally, some men stood up to testify with him with this lie. We heard him say, I will destroy the temple made with human hands. In 3 days I will build another without human hands. But even then they could not get their stories straight. The witnesses had twisted something that Jesus had said earlier to mean something that he did not intend it to mean. In the book of John we read where the Jewish leaders confronted him. In John chapter 2 verses 18 to 21 it says this: if you have this authority from God, show us a miraculous sign to prove it. All right, Jesus replied, destroy this temple in 3 days and I will raise it up. What? They exclaimed. It took 46 years to build this temple and you can do it in 3 days? But by this temple, Jesus meant his body. Jesus was speaking symbolically, but then they used those words to trap him. In verses 60 to 62, it says this: the high priest stood up before all the others and asked Jesus, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? Jesus made no reply. Then the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the blessed God? Jesus said, I am, and you will see me, the Son of Man, sitting at God's right hand in place of power and coming back on the clouds of heaven. And what Jesus is quoting here is two verses. Daniel chapter 7 verses 13 and Psalm 110 verse 1. Both these verses are messianic prophecy, so he's making it clear to them that he is, in fact, the Christ. In verses 63 and 64 it says this: the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror. Why do we need witnesses? You've all heard the blasphemy. What is your verdict? If Jesus had said what he had said isn't true, then he would have been guilty of blasphemy and the council would have every right to be offended. You see, in Jesus' day, blasphemy was punishable as a punishable offence. They're looking at Leviticus chapter 24:16. It says this: anyone who blasphemes in the name of the Lord will be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them, whether foreigner or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. So Jesus' words to them were outrageous if it wasn't true. After all, he was claimed to have divine power. So therefore, we can't just pass Jesus off as merely just a moral good teacher. A man who is merely a moral good teacher doesn't claim to have ultimate authority over heaven and earth. A man who is merely a good moral teacher doesn't say, I will sit at the right hand of God and someday you'll see me come back on the cloud of heaven. A man who says this cannot be merely just a good moral teacher. As it's been said by so many, such a man would either be a lunatic, a liar, or the Lord of all. In verse 65 it says this, and they all condemned him to death. And then some began to spit on him as they blindfolded him, and they hit his face with these fists. Who hit me? Who hit you at that time? You prophet, they jeered. And even the guards that were hitting him led him away. I thought about, I remember going to the zoo. Have you ever heard a little kid taunt lions? This little kid was about 6 years old, and there he was, standing outside the lion's den, and he's singing out, "Roar, lion, roar," as he was roaring at these lions. You're supposed to be the king of the jungle. Why don't you roar? As this little kid let out this roar. I can roar louder than you. He sounded so brave, looking down at those lions sleeping, and the lion just opened up his eyes and just went back to sleep, ignoring him. The lion paid no attention to this little boy who was about 6 years old. And I thought, if that lion just lifted his head and roared as loud as he could at that little 6-year-old boy, he probably would have had the fright of his life and ran away crying to his mum and dad. But that's the type of courage that the members of the council showed. As did later the Roman soldiers. It's an utterly coward type of courage. It's a bully's type of courage that exploits the weaknesses found in others. And at once these council members realised that Jesus would not retaliate, then they became bold indeed. I'm sure it seemed funny to them that he claimed to have divine authority, yet he was so easily captured. He claimed to be a king, yet his followers all deserted him as soon as he was arrested. They claimed to be the Messiah, and yet there he stood right before them, looking nothing like more than a Galilean peasant. They mocked him, they pushed him around, they put him in a cell. This brings us to the next stage of the passion, the suffering. Jesus was tried before Pilate. Let's look at part 1. There's going to be 3 little parts here. In verse 1 in chapter 5. Very early in the morning, the leading priests, the other leaders, the teachers of the religious law, the entire high council met to discuss their next step. They bound Jesus and took him to Pilate, the Roman governor. John offers a little bit more detail in chapter 18, verses 28 and 32. It says this. Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. He was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go in themselves because it would defile them and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover feast. So Pilate the governor went out to them and asked, "What is your charge against this man? We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he wasn't a criminal." They retorted. "Then take him away to the judge and judge him by your own laws," Pilate told them. "Only Romans are permitted to execute someone." The Jewish leaders replied, "This man fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way he would die." Luke's gospel puts it this way in Luke chapter 23, verse 2. "Then they began at once to state their case. This man had been leading our people to ruin by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government, by claiming that he is the king. He, the Messiah, is a king. A Roman governor would not put a Jew on trial for simply violating the Jewish law, in this case blasphemy. So the council had to phrase their accusations against Jesus in such a way that Pontius Pilate would also see Jesus as a threat. By saying he told them not to pay taxes is an outright lie, and saying he claimed to be a king, they're accusing him of crimes against the sovereign power of Rome. So Pilate would have to see these crimes seriously. About Pontius Pilate, we'll see in a few minutes that Pilate seemed quite eager to acquit Jesus. In truth, he probably didn't hold any animosity towards Jesus. He probably would have preferred not to have to deal with him or even the Jewish scholars. However, don't get the impression that Pilate was this helpless pawn in the hands of these religious leaders. He would not be easily manipulated. Had Jesus been found guilty of any of these allegations, Pilate would have known about it. Jesus was already well known in Jerusalem, but he was also known as a man of peace, not a political rebel. He taught his followers to pay their taxes, to obey the laws, and even if a soldier commanded to carry a person his gear for 1 mile, which the Roman law said they were permitted to do, Jesus said, then you should carry it 2 miles. He publicly stated to the citizens they should give to Caesar what belongs to him. Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. Pilate knew who Jesus was. He knew he wasn't a threat. And if Pilate considered Jesus a threat, he would have taken action against him long before all of this. And Pilate certainly didn't have a reputation of tolerance against dissidents. Neither, for that matter, nor did Rome in general. But for Pilate, he was in this difficult situation. He was on thin ice in Rome because some of the previous offences that had taken place while he was in office, which included slaughtering people who protested and did not like decisions that he made when he's under his rule. So during the trial of Jesus, Pilate was only looking out for Pilate. Pilate was all about Pilate. He cared nothing about justice. And he thought if he could have acquitted Jesus, but he refused to do so, even though he had the power to do it. He had the authority to do it. Pilate went back inside and called for Jesus to be brought to him. Are you king of the Jews? He asked him in John chapter 18, verse 33. Let's look at part 2. Pilate knew these charges were ridiculous. If Pilate had believed them at all, he wouldn't have tolerated the possibility of an insurrection for a moment, and Rome would have supported him all the way. When Pilate found Jesus was from Galilee, he thought of a quick and brilliant solution. In Luke chapter 23, verses 6 to 7, it says this, "Oh, he's a Galilean?" Pilate asked. When he answered that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas because in Galilee, under Herod's jurisdiction, Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. Pilate saw Herod as a safe escape route from this. If Herod had acquitted Jesus, then he was off the hook. If he condemned Jesus, then it was on Herod's shoulders. And even if Herod doesn't pass judgment, either way, at least then Pilate can state for the record it was made with Herod's input. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus. He'd heard about him. He'd been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. It says in Luke chapter 23, verses 8 and 9. When Jesus remained silent before Herod, he and his soldiers began mocking him. They poured a royal robe upon him and they sent him back to Pilate. Luke says in Luke chapter 23, verse 12, Herod and Pilate, who'd been enemies before, became friends that day. Let's look at part 3. Jesus was brought once again before Pilate. In verses 6 to 15, it says this, "Now it was the governor's custom to release one prisoner each year at Passover time, anyone the people requested. One of the prisoners at that time was Barabbas, convicted along with others for murdering during the insurrection, and a mob began to crowd towards Pilate, asking him to release the prisoners as usual. "Should I give you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked, for he realised now that the leading priests had arrested Jesus out of envy. But at this point, the leading priest stirred up the mob and demanded the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus. "But if I release Barabbas," Pilate asked, "what should I do with the man you call King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him!" "Why?" Pilate demanded. "What crime has he committed?" But the crowd only roared the louder, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, anxious to please the crowd, released Barabbas to them. Matthew's Gospel includes a little bit more detail. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 24, it says this, "Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere with the riot that was developing, so he sent for a bowl of water, washed his hands before the crowd, saying, 'I'm innocent of the blood of this man. The responsibility is yours.'" Now, this is a little bit of theatre here, but Pilate had no right to wash his hands of his responsibility, as he was the governor of the people. Some people often wonder how the crowd that cheered Jesus' entry into Jerusalem 5 days earlier could have turned so quickly against him. But part of the answer is it wasn't necessarily the same crowd. Many people who praised on the arrival of on Palm Sunday were fellow Galileans who'd come to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. The other part of the answer is it may have been somewhere in both crowds. They cheered Jesus' triumphant entry because they believed that he was a political Messiah who'd come to set them free from the oppressive rule of Rome. Now, less than a week later, they saw him arrested, beaten and standing silent before Pilate, and now that they realised that he wasn't the political leader they thought, so they turned on him. The crowd who stood outside the praetorium during Jesus' trial was relatively small. Some scholars say it was a few hundred, others say it was a few thousand, but either way it was a mere fraction of the overall population of Jerusalem. And just because a small group of people were shouting for his crucifixion did not give Pilate the permission to abdicate his responsibilities and obligations. He claimed he found no fault in Jesus, but just in case, he let his soldiers flog him. Then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers made a crown of long, sharp thorns and put it on his head. They put a royal robe upon him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They mocked him and hit him with their fists. It says in John chapter 18, verses 1 to 3. No one who had seen the Passion of Christ movie will ever soon forget this scene. Was it accurate? Sadly, it was. Yet it was toned down from the real thing. It was hard to stomach because as you watch it, the flogging, the scourging, it was such a violent form of punishment that many prisoners died in the process. The whip that was most often used had a wooden handle. It had 9 leather straps, and at the end of the strap was a piece of metal or a piece of rock. The whip cut into the back of Jesus, cutting his flesh to the bone. The Jews had a limit of 39 lashes when a man was flogged. Rome had none. They had no limit. Neither did the garrison of soldiers have any limits on the amount of mistreatment they could subject on their prisoner as long as they kept him long enough alive so he could be executed. After Jesus was flogged, he was presented to Pilate again. In John chapter 19, verses 4 and 5, it says this. Pilate went outside again and said to his people, "I'm going to bring you out now." And he understood clearly, "I find him not guilty." Then Jesus came out wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe. And Pilate said, "Here is the man." And the crowd began to shout for Jesus to be crucified. He again took Jesus inside and he said this to him privately. John chapter 19, verses 9 to 11. "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. "You won't talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize I have the power to release you or to crucify you?" Jesus then said, "You have no power over me unless it was given to you from above. So the one who brought to you has the greatest sin." Jesus was not excusing Pilate's actions here. And what did Jesus mean by the one who brought me to you? He could have been referring to Judas, or he may have been referring to Caiaphas. See, in John chapter 19, verses 12 to 15, it says this. Then Pilate tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders told him, "If you release this man, you are not a friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar." And when they said this, Pilate brought Jesus out to them. And again, Pilate stood down on the judgment seat on the platform that's called the stone pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It is now about noonday in preparation for the Passover. And Pilate said to the people, "Here is your king." "Away with him," they yelled. "Away with him, crucify him." "What? Crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the leading priests shouted back. Pilate appears to be intrigued by Jesus. He appears that he wants to release Jesus, but instead of doing so, which is in his power to do so, he's relatively, by a small band of people, having this decision made for him. He's being pushed in that direction. He doesn't have the gumption to stand against a small group of people who want their own way. It's hard to guess what motivated Pilate, but this much is clear. He had the power to acquit Jesus, but he didn't. And first century Christians knew that he was at fault. One of the earliest creeds of the early church contains the phrase that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. Not that he suffered under the Sanhedrin, not that he suffered at the hands of the high priest, but he suffered under Pontius Pilate. So in spite of all these cat and mouse games that he played about releasing Barabbas and finding no fault in Christ and washing his hands of the whole situation, he was the one that sentenced Jesus to die. John says in John 19:16, then Pilate gave Jesus over to them to be crucified. The trial of Jesus was a travesty of justice, according to both Jewish and Roman law. He should never have been arrested. He should never have been put on trial. He should never have been sentenced to death. He should never have been crucified, yet he was. Here's something for you to meditate on this week, leading up to Good Friday. Jesus faced man's injustice, so you don't have to face God's justice. We don't approach God demanding that we be given what we deserve, because we all deserve hell. For the wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. We don't come to God demanding justice, we come to him asking for mercy. The Bible says in Psalm 103, verses 10 and 12, he does not treat us as our sins deserve, or repay us according to our iniquities. For as far as east is from the west, so far he's removed our transgressions from us. This is the mercy of God. We see it at work in Christ. Christ allowed himself to suffer the imaginable pain so that we can experience his healing power in our lives. That's the garden, the olive grove, Garden Gethsemane experience that I spoke about last week. We need God's healing in our lives. Each and every one of us has experienced suffering, pain, heartache, disappointment, have made mistakes. People are suffering through bondages that need to be broken. It's time to enter into that olive grove of Gethsemane. Don't walk around it. You can't. That's taking the easy road. The Bible talks about the narrow road, the hard road. That's the olive grove of Gethsemane that each and every one of us must enter to receive God's healing, to break those bondages that are holding you back in your life so you can fulfill the call that God has placed on your life and live the life that you're called to live. Don't back away from it. Don't run away from it. Don't turn your back on it. It's time to enter the olive grove of Gethsemane and experience God's mercy in action for your life. The only way out is to go all the way in. We must never forget Jesus faced man's injustice, so we don't have to face God's justice. We're going to close this service right now, and we're going to sing, "Are You Washed in the Blood of the Lamb?" I want you to think about, as we sing this song, Jesus faced man's injustice, so we don't have to face God's